On a warm spring night in Columbus, Ohio, in 2006, a medical student walked into a crowded bar with friends to celebrate the start of spring break. By morning, he had vanished, and no camera ever captured him leaving. Columbus, Ohio, a city that feels calm on the surface, yet always humming with quiet energy underneath. In early April, winter loosens its grip. The air softens, and the streets outside the Ohio State University campus begin to fill again, with laughter, with late-night plans, with students hoping to escape the grind of exams and lectures, even if just for a few hours. But on this particular night, beneath the glow of streetlights and the pulse of music from campus bars, a story began that would haunt the city for years. A story with no ending. A story with no explanation, a story built around a single, impossible question. Inside the heart of the campus nightlife stood a bar called the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a bright, loud second-floor hangout reached by an exposed escalator rising from the sidewalk. That escalator was visible from the street. The entrance was monitored by cameras. It was the kind of place where you could see people coming and going in a steady stream, hour after hour, a place where every movement seemed recorded, every moment preserved. And yet, one man walked inside and never appeared walking out. His name was Randall Shaffer, 27 years old, a second-year medical student who had stepped into the Ugly Tuna that night with two friends. It was the start of spring break, the promise of a week away from classes, just hours to let go, unwind, and breathe. Brian smiled, laughed, posed for photos, and drifted from spot to spot inside the bar. Nothing seemed unusual. Nothing hinted at what was coming. Then the night ended. Or at least, it ended for everyone else. When his friends regrouped outside, expecting Brian to follow, expecting him to be just a few steps behind, he didn't appear. Minutes passed, then hours. Calls were unanswered. Plans for the next day suddenly fell apart. And by morning, it became clear that Brian was simply gone. What followed was confusion, disbelief, and then a chilling realization. Security footage showed Brian entering the Ugly Tuna. It did not show him leaving, not through the escalator entrance, not through the service areas, not through any exit at all, as if the bar had somehow swallowed him whole. In the days that followed, Columbus would hold its breath. Investigators would replay the footage over and over. Family and friends would search, plead, hope, and fear. And the city would drift into one of the most baffling mysteries in modern American true crime. Because no matter how deeply you analyze the evidence, no matter how many times you trace Brian's steps inside that bar, one fact remains. A man walked into a crowded room, surrounded by people, surrounded by cameras, and vanished into nothing. And that is where this story begins.
Randall Shaffer was not the kind of person anyone imagined vanishing without a trace. He was 27 years old, tall, athletic, and unmistakably charismatic. The type of man who drew people in without trying, who smiled easily, laughed loudly, and gave the impression of someone walking confidently toward a bright future. Born on February 25, 1979, Brian grew up in Ohio with his parents, Randy and Renee, and his younger brother, Derek. From childhood, he carried a warmth that everyone noticed. Friends remembered him as quick to comfort others, quick to joke, and quick to turn ordinary moments into memories. He played sports, listened to rock music, and dreamt of the ocean, even though he lived in the Midwest. As he grew older, those dreams sharpened into something more defined, the dream of becoming a doctor. He worked hard, studied late, pushed himself towards something bigger than the world he'd known growing up. Eventually, that dedication led him to the Ohio State University College of Medicine, one of the most competitive medical programs in the region. For Brian, it was a huge achievement, but it was also demanding, overwhelming, and at times all-consuming. Medical school has a way of testing even the strongest minds. The long nights, the endless exams, the rotation pressures. All of it builds into a kind of constant, quiet stress. But even with that weight on him, Brian stayed grounded. He found balance in his friendships, in his relationship, and in music. He loved Pearl Jam, not casually, not as background noise, but as a deep, emotional connection. Their lyrics spoke to him. Their concerts recharged him. Music gave him something medical school couldn't: space to breathe. And then there was Alexis. Alexis Wagoner was Brian's girlfriend, and to many who knew them, they seemed like the perfect pair. Steady, affectionate, moving through life with shared goals. They met at Ohio State, both in demanding academic programs, and they understood the pressures each faced. They studied together, laughed together, and dreamed of a future beyond exams and classrooms. That future was supposed to begin soon. They had a trip planned, a short getaway to Florida at the start of April. Sunshine, ocean air, a break from the intensity of school. Alexis was excited. Brian seemed excited too, at least on the surface. But beneath that surface, things were more complicated. In early 2006, just weeks before spring break, Brian suffered a devastating loss. His mother, Renee, passed away after a long battle with myelodysplasia. Her illness had lasted years, and Brian had been by her side through the pain, the hospital visits, and the uncertainty. Her passing broke something inside him. It softened his voice, clouded his eyes, and left him searching for emotional footing. He didn't always talk about the depth of that grief, but those close to him could feel it. His father, Randy, later said that Brian seemed overwhelmed, exhausted, and emotionally stretched thin. Some friends believed he was trying to stay strong for everyone else, carrying more weight than he ever admitted. Medical school, grief, expectations, responsibility. It was a storm of pressures, and Brian was trying to push through it. Still, even in those heavy weeks, he remained the same kind soul he'd always been. He participated in classes, spent time with Alexis, and tried to move forward. Spring break was coming, and with it, the hope of a reset. A moment to breathe, a moment to recover. But it wasn't only responsibility and grief shaping Brian's world. He also carried a quieter, personal dream. As close friends later shared, Brian sometimes talked about a life beyond Ohio, perhaps living near the beach, perhaps working somewhere slower, sunnier, more peaceful. The idea wasn't concrete, but it lingered. A what if, a someday. His father believed he might have been wrestling with big questions about the direction of his life. Was he truly happy in medical school? Was he following his passion or simply following a path he once chose and felt obligated to stay on? Nobody knew for sure. Brian didn't speak openly about those deeper thoughts. He kept them quietly inside, wrapped in layers of charm, humor, and gentle resilience. By March 2006, as the weather warmed and the semester pushed toward its final stretch, Brian seemed to be finding small pockets of normalcy again. He studied hard. He reconnected with friends and made plans for the Florida trip with Alexis. He even talked about the promise of spring break, a rare, precious week of freedom. And then came March 31st, the night before his long-awaited vacation. The night before he was supposed to board a plane with Alexis. The night that would become the starting point of one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. From the outside, Brian's world seemed steady enough. He had the talent, the intelligence, the support, the love of a girlfriend who cared deeply for him, the pride of a father and brother who admired him, the memory of a mother he adored, and a future that still looked bright, even with the weight of grief pressing down on him. But real lives are rarely as clean or simple as they appear. Grief moves in waves, stress builds quietly, and even the strongest people can carry silent burdens no one else sees. Nobody could have predicted that within hours of this ordinary spring evening, everything would change. A night out with friends, a bar filled with laughter, a camera catching one last glimpse of a young man who should have had decades of life ahead of him. And then, nothing. Before we explore the events of that night, before we reconstruct every minute from the moment Brian stepped out of his apartment to the moment he was last seen on camera, it's important to remember who he was. A son, a brother, a friend, a medical student, a young man coping with grief, yet fighting for joy. A person with hopes, flaws, dreams, and questions. A person who did not simply vanish, but was taken from the world of those who loved him, leaving behind a mystery that continues to echo nearly 2 decades later. This is the story of Brian Shaffer, and understanding his life is the first step toward understanding the night he disappeared.
March 31st, 2006, the last evening before spring break. For most students at Ohio State University, the anticipation was almost electric. A full week away from lectures, labs, and obligations. A week to reclaim sleep, energy, and a sense of being human again. For Brian Shaffer, the night began much like it did for countless students on campus, yet with a deeper undercurrent. It had been a difficult semester, emotionally, academically, and personally. But the arrival of spring break carried a sense of relief he desperately needed. A small exhale before the next challenge. And with a flight to Florida scheduled for the next day with his girlfriend, the night held an extra touch of excitement. The plan wasn't complicated, just a casual night out, a chance to unwind. Brian met up with his friend William Clint Florence, someone he had known since college. They were close enough to move comfortably together through the chaos of campus nightlife. Around early evening, the two began the night with a drink, maybe 2, letting the tension of the week fall away. The weather was mild for early spring in Ohio. The city carried that familiar Friday night buzz, voices on sidewalks, music spilling from open doors, the subtle shift into weekend mode. As the night continued, Brian and Clint made their way through a few campus bars. They walked, talked, laughed, the way friends do when they finally have a break from everything pressing down on them. Later, another friend, Meredith Reed, joined them. She offered to drive them to the bar where they planned to end the night. That final destination would be the last place Brian Shaffer was ever seen. The Ugly Tuna Saloona, a second-story bar perched above the street in the Gateway District, near the edge of Ohio State's campus. The entrance wasn't like most bars. Instead of a typical door off the sidewalk, visitors reached it by stepping onto an escalator that rose from street level to the bar's front entrance. That escalator was in full view, well lit, watched by a surveillance camera positioned near the top. Anyone entering or leaving the bar through the main entrance would naturally appear on that footage. It was a setup that felt secure, open, and easy to monitor. A place where it seemed impossible for anyone to simply disappear. Brian, Clint, and Meredith arrived at the Ugly Tuna shortly before 1 a.m. The footage shows them riding up the escalator together. Brian is dressed casually, jeans, a shirt, and sneakers, looking relaxed, maybe slightly tired, yet still carrying that easy, familiar energy people recognized. Inside, the bar was loud and packed, the way college bars often are on spring weekends. Music thumped, conversations overlapped, and the warm glow of neon signs cut through dim corners. Groups of friends clustered around tables, shared drinks, moved from spot to spot. It was chaotic, but in a predictable way.
the kind of environment where nothing seems unusual unless you're looking for something. Brian, by all accounts, was in good spirits. He wandered through the bar with Clint, stopping here and there, chatting with people, blending into the flow of the night. At one point, he stepped away briefly, moving toward the bar area. At another moment, he bumped into two women he seemed to know from school. A brief, normal interaction captured by cameras inside the bar. There was nothing dramatic, nothing out of character, nothing that hinted at danger. But as the night edged closer to closing time, the rhythm inside the bar began to shift. People finished their last drinks. Conversations faded. Groups started planning their next steps, heading home, grabbing late-night food, catching a ride back to campus. And somewhere in this ordinary moment, the timelines began to separate. Clint later said that he believed Brian was still somewhere inside the bar, maybe talking to someone, maybe preparing to follow them out. Meredith believed the same. There was no reason to think otherwise. After all, they had all arrived together. And there was only one reasonable exit, the same escalator they had come up. But around closing time, when the crowd thinned and the remaining patrons were ushered toward the exit, Brian wasn't there. Clint and Meredith stepped outside onto the street-level plaza. They waited. They looked around. They expected Brian to appear within seconds, stepping into the night with his usual ease. He didn't. At first, it didn't seem alarming. Bars are noisy. People drift off for a quick conversation or head to the restroom before leaving. Maybe he had stopped to talk to someone he knew. Maybe he got delayed. Maybe he was coming down behind them. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Clint tried calling him. No answer. Meredith called too. Still nothing. They eventually assumed, reasonably at the time, that Brian might have left from another campus bar earlier in the night, or that maybe he had decided to head back to his apartment on his own. The night had been long, the drinks steady, and sometimes friends just simply get separated in the crowd. Nothing about the situation felt threatening yet. It felt merely inconvenient. What no one realized in that moment, standing outside the bar, is that it would become the single most important moment in the entire case. The moment where a simple night out began to fracture into something unheard of. The next morning, Alexis tried calling Brian several times. They were supposed to leave for their Florida trip. The bags were packed, the tickets were ready, and the excitement had been building. But there was no answer. Not from his phone, not from his apartment, not anywhere. The last place anyone had seen him was inside the Ugly Tuna Saloona. When investigators later reviewed the surveillance footage, the timeline became clear, disturbingly clear. Brian was seen entering the bar at around 1:15 a.m. alongside Clint and Meredith. He was seen inside, talking, moving through small groups of people, and then nothing. No camera captured him leaving, not through the escalator entrance, not through any of the visible exits, not through any back hallway, not through any emergency door. He simply ceased to exist on camera. Security systems are imperfect. Blind spots exist. Cameras malfunction. But for a man to be recorded walking into a bar and for no footage, not a single frame, to show him walking out in a public place, in a monitored building, is something else entirely. Something that defies logic, defies expectation, defies explanation. That night, the timeline is crisp, it is tight, it is precise, and yet it leaves everyone who examines it asking the same impossible question. How can someone enter a building and never be seen leaving? Before the world knew it, March 31st, just another spring Friday, would become the focal point of years of investigation, speculation, and heartbreak. And everything began inside that bar, with a night that seemed ordinary, with friends who believed they were all heading home together, with a final appearance on camera, a final moment captured before Brian Shaffer disappeared from the world. When the sun rose on April 1st, 2006, Columbus looked like any other Saturday morning after a long Friday night. Students slept in.
Cafes opened their doors slowly. The city hummed with the gentle quiet of a weekend beginning. But inside one apartment near the Ohio State campus, things were already very wrong. Brian Shaffer was supposed to be awake early. He was supposed to be getting ready for a trip to Florida with his girlfriend, Alexis. He was supposed to be answering his phone, replying to messages, and preparing for the first truly relaxing week he had looked forward to in months. Instead, there was silence. Alexis called once, no answer. Then again, no answer. She called several more times, each attempt more anxious than the last. At first, she assumed he might be sleeping in. Maybe he had stayed out later than usual. Maybe he was tired or hungover. Maybe he'd forgotten to charge his phone. All reasonable explanations, at least in the early hours. But by mid-morning, the worry sharpened into genuine fear. She reached out to Brian's friends, including Clint and Meredith. What she learned only deepened the unease. None of them had seen or heard from Brian since the night before. Clint assumed he had gone home. Meredith assumed he had slipped away at some point during the night. But neither knew where he had actually gone after the moment they lost sight of him at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. His father, Randy, was contacted soon after. And for him, the worry was immediate, heavy, and unmistakable. He had lost his wife only weeks before. The wound was still raw, the grief still fresh. The idea of something being wrong with one of his sons, especially Brian, hit him with a force he could barely process. By Saturday evening, it was clear something was terribly, profoundly wrong. Brian wasn't answering calls. He wasn't responding to texts. He hadn't returned home. His car was still parked at his apartment complex, and he had never shown up at the airport. Finally, the call was made to Columbus police. In missing person cases, the first decision officers make is whether the disappearance seems voluntary or involuntary. Adults are legally allowed to vanish by choice. They can take time alone, change plans, travel unexpectedly, or cut off contact without committing any crime. But the moment officers learned that Brian never boarded his flight, never came home, never contacted anyone, and that he had last been seen in a crowded bar, something shifted. This wasn't normal. This wasn't routine. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of a disappearance. Investigators began by retracing Brian's last known steps, confirming the timeline at the Ugly Tuna Saloona. The management cooperated fully. They handed over every piece of security footage from that night. Every second recorded. Every angle captured. Nothing withheld. The review began slowly, methodically. Officers watched the entrance footage from the escalator camera, and there, clear as day, was Brian, riding up with his friends at around 1:15 a.m. He looked steady, alert, and in control, not stumbling, not confused, not distressed. He walked inside, surrounded by people, under bright lights. Inside the bar, additional cameras caught brief glimpses of him moving through the crowd, talking to two women, walking near the bar area. Nothing unusual, nothing suspicious, nothing out of place. And then, the footage ended. The next step was obvious. Review the exit footage. Everyone who left through the main entrance had to pass the escalator camera. Everyone. There was no other public exit that would bypass that lens. Investigators watched the footage. Then they rewatched it. Then they slowed it down frame by frame. They saw Clint leaving. They saw Meredith leaving. They saw dozens of other patrons. They saw groups, couples, individuals, every person who walked down that escalator. But they never saw Brian. He did not appear leaving the bar. Not at closing time. Not minutes later. Not in the early morning. Not at all. The footage was clear, consistent, and complete. And yet, no Brian. The discovery was so shocking, so profoundly confusing, that investigators questioned whether the footage might be incomplete. Maybe a camera malfunctioned, maybe a time segment was missing, maybe the recording system had dropped frames. These things happen. No system is perfect. So they reviewed it again, and again, and again. Nothing changed. The footage was intact. Next, they turned their attention to the bar's layout.
The Ugly Tuna Saloona had more than just the main entrance. It had emergency exits, service hallways, back corridors, and an area under construction during that period. Officers asked the staff and building managers to explain every possible route inside or out. There was a service exit that led into a construction zone, an area dimly lit, cluttered with equipment, and not actively monitored by cameras. If someone left through that exit, it was, theoretically possible, they might avoid the escalator camera. But the route was complicated, partially obstructed, and not something most patrons used. It wasn't a normal exit, not a door most people would even recognize as a way out. Still, investigators couldn't rule it out. They searched the construction area. They checked hallways, storage spaces, stairwells, and maintenance corridors. They looked for any sign, any at all, that Brian might have taken a wrong turn, wandered into danger, or encountered something unexpected. There was nothing. Police began interviewing everyone who interacted with Brian that night. Friends, staff, patrons, anyone who might have seen or spoken to him. Everyone said the same thing. He seemed fine. He didn't appear distressed or disoriented. He wasn't arguing, panicking, or acting strangely. He was just normal. Brian was simply a young man out with friends enjoying a late night before a long-planned vacation. But when closing time came, he was gone. The shock intensified when investigators considered the timeline. Brian had been inside the bar minutes before it emptied, yet not a single witness remembered seeing him exit. Not a single person recalled him pushing through the crowd, walking down the escalator, or stepping into the night air. In a bar packed with people, not one memory placed him outside afterward. It was as if a piece of the night had vanished, erased from existence. When investigators expanded their search beyond the bar, the urgency grew. They visited Brian's apartment. No sign of him. They checked the surrounding area. Nothing. His cell phone remained silent. His bank accounts untouched. His credit cards unused. No calls. No messages. Nothing that suggested he was alive and moving somewhere else. The deeper officers looked, the clearer it became that Brian had disappeared inside the bar or immediately outside it, in a manner that defied logic. The disappearance stunned not only the investigators, but the entire Columbus community. How could a healthy, aware, intelligent young man simply vanish in a public place with surveillance cameras recording every movement? It didn't make sense. It still doesn't. But one thing was clear. The moment Brian walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona was the last verifiable moment of his known life. A moment captured, frozen, unexplainable. And as the search intensified, that mystery only deepened.
In the days after Brian Shaffer vanished, the city of Columbus shifted from quiet confusion to alarm to a full-scale search unlike anything the campus community had seen in years. What began as a simple missing person call quickly escalated into a mystery with no edges, no center, and no clear place to begin. The first major wave of the search focused on the area surrounding the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the last confirmed location of Brian's existence. Investigators knew the clock was ticking. The first 48 hours are critical in any missing person case, especially when there is no evidence of voluntary disappearance. But here, every passing moment introduced a new, unsettling reality. There were no clues, no trail, no direction. Police officers, campus security teams, and trained search and rescue dogs fanned out across the Gateway District. They searched the sidewalks, alleys, parking structures, and loading areas around the bar. They moved through neighboring buildings, stairwells, rooftops, basements, and service corridors. They checked dumpsters, embankments, and every hidden corner where a person might have collapsed or been left unseen. Nothing. Not a single item belonging to Brian. Not a footprint, not a scrap of clothing. No evidence of a fall, an accident, or foul play. Search dogs were brought in. Dogs trained to detect human scent, even faint traces left behind days earlier. They were walked along the streets surrounding the bar, through back alleys, through construction zones, and along drainage paths. The dogs picked up no trail leading away from the Ugly Tuna. It was as though Brian had never left the bar, or as though his scent vanished entirely on the property. This absence of scent, this blank slate of evidence, baffled handlers. Usually, even in crowded environments, dogs can pick up something, a drift of odor, a direction, a trace on the wind. With Brian, there was nothing. At the same time, investigators expanded their physical search. They descended into storm drains. They inspected sewer systems. They checked beneath grates and inside access tunnels. It was dangerous, grim work, but necessary. If Brian had somehow walked into a restricted area, slipped, or suffered an accident, he might be trapped where no camera or passerby would ever see him. Again, nothing. No trace. Next came the buildings adjacent to the Ugly Tuna. Officers obtained access to storage rooms, mechanical areas, and old sections of the complex that had been renovated, partially torn down, or were still under construction. They searched behind walls, under stairwells, and around the structural skeleton of the building. These were places the public never entered, spaces where a wrong turn could prove deadly. Every section was cleared. No sign of Brian. As the physical search widened, the investigative search deepened. Detectives interviewed everyone connected to Brian. His father, Randy. His brother, Derek. His girlfriend, Alexis, who was devastated, confused, and clinging to hope. They spoke to classmates, friends, professors, neighbors, and anyone who might have known Brian's movements in the hours or days before the disappearance. They also questioned his two friends from that night, Clint and Meredith. Both cooperated with police interviews early on. Both explained the same sequence. They entered the bar together. They lost sight of Brian inside. They left close to closing time, waited for him, then assumed he had already gone home. Their stories were consistent. Their timelines aligned. And yet, nothing in those interviews provided a direction for investigators to follow. Police then turned their attention to the bar's employees and the crowd present that night. The Ugly Tuna was popular, often packed with students and young professionals. Detectives asked staff members what they remembered from that night. Most recalled it as typical: loud, busy, chaotic. No fights, no unusual incidents, no disturbances. No one recalled seeing Brian leave or interacting with anyone suspicious. Dozens of patrons from that night were contacted. Many didn't remember Brian at all. Some remembered seeing him briefly in passing. None could describe anything out of the ordinary. The couple of people seen talking to him on camera had nothing to report. They described a normal, harmless conversation. With every interview, the same unsettling pattern emerged. The night was ordinary, until Brian vanished. The next major step was a deeper forensic analysis of the surveillance footage. Investigators reviewed it not only for Brian, but for anything unusual. Any suspicious movement, any figure whose face was obscured. Every second was played again and again. Digital experts enhanced the footage, zoomed into backgrounds, studied shadows, and slowed sequences frame by frame. The footage revealed nothing new. Brian entered, others left. Brian never appeared again. Investigators refused to accept that result blindly. They questioned the bar's camera configuration. Were there blind spots? Yes, like in most bars. Were there maintenance areas not covered by cameras? Yes, especially during construction. Could someone theoretically leave without being caught on camera? Possibly, but improbable. The bar layout was not designed for stealth. It was open, bright, and centered around a single main exit.
But improbability was not impossibility.
Detectives pushed further outward. They checked ATM cameras, street cameras, parking garage cameras, campus cameras, any lens that might have caught Brian walking away from the area. They cross-referenced timestamps, tracked vehicles leaving the area, and looked for anyone matching Brian's height and clothing. Still nothing. It was as though the moment he entered the Ugly Tuna Saloona, the chain of visual evidence snapped permanently. Meanwhile, investigators explored every lead that came in from the public. Tips ranged from possible sightings to overheard rumors to vague suggestions. Some tips offered specific directions: a path near a river, a parking garage, a wooded area behind campus. Each tip, no matter how unlikely, was checked. Search teams walked miles of riverbank, combed through brush and undergrowth, scanned parks, fields, and trails. No result, no clue, no closure. As days turned into weeks, investigators broadened their examination of Brian's life. They looked carefully at his electronic footprint, phone records, email accounts, class schedules, medical school obligations, digital activity, everything. They saw no signs of planning a disappearance, no suspicious messages, no withdrawals. His phone was never used again. His bank accounts remained untouched. His apartment appeared normal, undisturbed. He had made no preparations for disappearing voluntarily. His passport was at home. His clothes were untouched. His life was frozen in place. Detectives also looked at his mental and emotional state. The recent death of his mother was a profound trauma, and investigators took that seriously. They spoke to friends who knew how deeply Brian had been grieving. But even then, nothing in his behavior suggested he intended to disappear. He had a trip planned, a girlfriend he cared deeply about, exams to prepare for, a career ahead of him. Everything in his life was moving forward, not away. Multiple specialized units joined the effort, including state-level search teams and outside experts experienced in missing person cases. Some revisited the bar. Others created reconstruction models of the layout. Others studied the timeline minute by minute, looking for any inconsistency. Still, there was nothing. Months passed, then years, and the investigation kept circling back to the same single location, the Ugly Tuna Saloona, to the same single piece of confirmed evidence, the footage of Brian going in, and to the same impossible absence, the lack of footage showing him leaving. The case became a haunting paradox, a mystery built around cameras that should have revealed everything, but revealed nothing. Police officers, some of whom worked the case for years, later said openly that Brian's disappearance was the most baffling investigation of their careers, because every time they followed the evidence, every time they tried to reason through the possibilities, the case returned to the same conclusion. People don't vanish in full public view. But somehow, Brian Shaffer did. And the search that followed, relentless, exhausting, heartbreaking, brought the world no closer to finding him. When a disappearance offers no trail, no clues, no movement, and no verified sightings, what remains is a maze of theories, each one attempting to fill in the silence left behind. The case of Brian Shaffer has been studied, restudied, and debated for nearly 2 decades, and through that time, several explanations have surfaced, each with its own possibilities, its own limits, and its own unanswered questions. None of them are confirmed, none of them solve the mystery, but together they show why Brian Shaffer's disappearance has become one of the most perplexing cases in American true crime. We begin with the most straightforward possibility, a misadventure. This theory suggests that Brian may have accidentally found his way into a dangerous area inside or around the bar. The Ugly Tuna Saloona was undergoing construction at the time. Certain service doors and hallways led into unfinished spaces, poorly lit areas, or sections with exposed equipment. If Brian had stepped into one of these areas, disoriented or simply curious, something tragic could have happened. Investigators considered the possibility of a fall, perhaps into a shaft, a hidden drop, or an area under renovation that was not immediately obvious. Searches were conducted in these spaces, including construction zones and maintenance interiors. No evidence was found, no trace of an accident, and nothing to suggest that Brian was trapped somewhere unseen. Yet the theory remains because construction environments can be unpredictable, and certain hazards might have been overlooked at the time. Still, most investigators agree that such an accident would likely have left some sign behind, and it didn't. Another theory explored was the possibility of a voluntary disappearance, the idea that Brian chose to leave his life behind. In theory, this scenario fits certain emotional elements. Brian was grieving deeply. The loss of his mother weighed heavily on him. He had expressed interest at times in living near the ocean, dreaming of a different kind of life. But even with those factors, the theory faces significant obstacles. He had a flight scheduled with his girlfriend. He had shown no indications of wanting to sever ties with her or with his family. There was no withdrawal of money, no record of travel, no planning, no preparation. His passport was at home. His apartment showed no signs of someone packing or getting ready to run. And above all, disappearing voluntarily through the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a brightly lit bar with a monitored exit, would require avoiding cameras perfectly in a moment of complete spontaneity. While possible, it remains difficult to reconcile with the evidence. A third theory, one that emerges in nearly all unexplained disappearances, is a medical emergency or accident outside the bar. Could Brian have left through an unseen route, collapsed nearby, and been undiscovered? Could he have experienced a sudden medical event while alone? Searches of the surrounding area make this unlikely. The region around the bar was swept multiple times by police, volunteers, and search dogs. Drainage areas, rooftops, parking garages, alleyways, all were checked extensively. If Brian had suffered a medical emergency in the open or in a reachable area, someone would likely have found him. Another major possibility often discussed is foul play, not as an accusation toward any person, but as a category of explanation. In cases where individuals vanish without witnesses or evidence, investigators must consider the possibility that something harmful occurred. But here, too, the case presents challenges. There were no signs of a struggle inside the bar. No witnesses reported unusual behavior, dangerous interactions, or moments of conflict. And the bar's entrance was monitored. Any confrontation on the escalator or near the street would have been likely visible on camera. Still, foul play cannot be entirely ruled out. Cameras capture angles, not every angle. Crowds obscure things, blind spots exist, and even well-lit areas can hide brief moments. Another theory focuses on the construction layout of the bar during that time. Because the Ugly Tuna was undergoing renovations, certain areas were partially dismantled, taped off, or temporarily adjusted. Some exits may have been accessible only to staff or workers. A theory suggests that Brian may have taken a route rarely used by patrons, stepping through an unexpected doorway or slipping into a construction hallway that led to a rear service area. If that happened, he could have exited the building without passing the main camera. But this theory, too, raises questions. Why would he choose such an exit? Why would he head into a dim, cluttered construction space instead of leaving with his friends? And if he did exit through a worker's hallway, where did he go next? No nearby camera caught his movement. No witness saw him, and none of the construction areas revealed evidence of an accident or entrapment. A more complex theory examines the blind spots of the cameras themselves. Although the bar had surveillance, the camera system was not comprehensive. Certain angles were missing. Certain corners fell outside the lens. In a crowded environment, a single camera position can overlook dozens of movements. Some investigators believe Brian may have walked behind a group of people exiting together, his face obscured, his clothing blending into the crowd. If someone with a similar height and build left at the same time, Brian could have been hidden in the overlap, a situation where his exit occurred but was visually missed. But this theory relies heavily on coincidence, the right moment, the right angle, the right overlap of bodies. And it still doesn't explain why none of the street-level cameras, even those with lower resolution,
captured any trace of him nearby. The final set of theories revolve around the unknown, the possibility that something occurred outside of the scope of what the current evidence captures, a rare event, a sudden, private moment, a situation with no witnesses, no clear beginning, and no documented end. These theories aren't guesses about guilt or blame. They are simply acknowledgments of the limits of knowledge. Surveillance cameras give the illusion of total visibility, but even with technology, human movement remains unpredictable. People can slip through moments in ways that defy expectation. What makes Brian Shaffer's case so haunting is not the theories themselves, but the fact that every theory leaves gaps. If it was a misadventure, where is the evidence? If it was voluntary, where is the trace? If it was an accident, why was nothing found? If it was foul play, how did no camera capture anything? If he left undetected, why did no external camera see him? Each explanation partially fits and partially fails. And that is why this disappearance continues to captivate investigators, criminologists, and everyday people who encounter the story for the first time. It is a case that defies the patterns of other disappearances, a case where the last known moment is frozen in a place that should have provided answers, but instead created more questions. Brian walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona, a bar with cameras, crowds, lights, and witnesses. And from that moment on, every theory struggles against one impossible fact. He was never seen leaving. And that unresolved paradox is what keeps the mystery alive.
In the days after Brian Shaffer vanished, what began as confusion turned into grief, and then into a quiet, suffocating kind of waiting. Waiting for a call, a clue, a witness, a single piece of information that might crack open the silence and bring Brian home. But that call never came. His father, Randy Shaffer, became the public face of the search. With a calm but determined voice, he gave interviews, spoke to newspapers, appealed to the public. He walked the streets of Columbus, placing missing posters with Brian's photo, a warm, handsome young man with kind eyes and an easy smile. Randy visited the Ugly Tuna Saloona regularly, just to look, just to stand near the last place his son was seen. He believed, for a long time, that Brian was alive, somewhere, out there, waiting to be found. But hope, when stretched too far, begins to fray. Months passed, then a year, then two. Brian's younger brother, Derek, stood by his father's side during the search, but the strain on the family grew heavier with time. Grief has a way of isolating people. It wraps around families and pulls them into different corners. Everyone copes differently. Some become relentless, others quiet, others withdrawn. Alexis, Brian's girlfriend, was devastated. She left him dozens of voicemails in the weeks and months after the disappearance. She told him she loved him, told him to come home, told him she believed he was out there. At one point, she even kept her phone service connected just in case he called. She never got a reply. Still, she kept hoping. The Columbus police continued their investigation for years, keeping the case open and reviewing new leads as they came. They followed every tip, every false sighting, every distant rumor. Some leads pointed to other cities. Some were based on mistaken identity. One even involved a man resembling Brian who appeared briefly in a YouTube video from a band concert years later. But it wasn't him. The hardest part, investigators admitted, was that nothing ever changed. No progress, no evidence, no movement. Brian's face remained on missing posters. His name appeared in true crime podcasts, blogs, television specials. His case became a kind of folklore in Columbus, a story that people whispered about on campus, on sidewalks, at parties. How does someone disappear from a bar with cameras? Why has no one come forward? Is he alive or long gone? Years continued to pass. Then, in 2008, 2 years after Brian vanished, tragedy struck again. Randy Shaffer, Brian's father, died in a freak accident. A tree branch, loosened in a storm, collapsed on him in his backyard. Just like that, the one person who had carried the torch of the search, who had stood at the front of every news report, who had refused to stop looking, was gone. At Randy's funeral, someone left a message in the online memorial guest book. It read simply, "Dad, I love you. Love, Brian, U.S. Virgin Islands." It was traced, tracked, investigated. It turned out to be a cruel hoax. Someone pretending to be Brian. A false hope that brought only more pain. Another wound for the family to absorb. And still, the silence remained. In the years since, Brian's case has never been officially closed. He remains listed as a missing person by the FBI and the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation. His DNA, dental records, and medical information are on file. His image, digitally aged, is used in hopes that someone, somewhere, might recognize him if he's still alive. Every so often, a tip surfaces. Every so often, someone claims to have seen him, but none of it leads anywhere. Today, the Ugly Tuna Saloona no longer exists. The bar was eventually shut down and the space was renovated. The escalator, the plaza, the bright lights, they're all gone now. But for those who remember Brian's story, that corner of Columbus will always feel haunted. Each April, some people pause to remember him, to mark the anniversary, to share his story again, to keep his name in the air. His disappearance still appears in documentaries, YouTube deep dives, Reddit theories, and college journalism classes. It has become more than a case. It's a question people carry with them long after they hear it for the first time. Where did Brian Shaffer go? He was a medical student, a son, a brother, a boyfriend, a friend, a Pearl Jam fan who wore his heart in his music and his pain in silence. He walked into a bar filled with people, under surveillance, on a night that should have ended like any other. And then, nothing. What makes his case unforgettable isn't just the footage. It's the impossibility, the contradiction, the cruel physics of how someone can enter a monitored building and never, ever be seen again. There is no satisfying ending. There is no final answer. But there is this, a name. Brian Shaffer. He deserves more than to be a headline from 2006. He deserves to be found. He deserves to come home, or at the very least, for someone to speak. If you know something, say something. If you remember anything, share it. Share this story. Keep his name alive, because someone, somewhere, knows what happened to Brian Shaffer, and every voice brings us closer to the truth.